So wonderful to be here. I want to thank Pastor Graham and Scott Turner for arranging for us to be here at one of the premier spiritual temples in our country. But I want to start with a word of prayer. Kind Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to talk about the things that are important to you. And give us courage and give us the strength to turn things around in this country. We ask in Jesus' worthy name and for his sake. Amen. Well, you know, I always start out by a disclaimer. You know, everybody gives disclaimers these days. Say, I'm on this board, I belong to this organization, and therefore you have to take everything with a grain of salt. Well, my disclaimer is, I'm not politically correct. Now, that does not mean that I try to offend people. I don't. But it does mean that I don't twist myself into a pretzel trying to make sure that I don't offend somebody, because somebody's always going to be offended these days. Maybe not in this congregation, but in the general society. People walk around with their feelings on their sleeve, just waiting for you to say something, rather than trying to understand the meaning of what's being said. You know, a lot of people have asked me, how did you go from being a physician to the political world? And I ask myself that too. But, you know, it started in 2013 when I was asked to give the keynote address at the Presidential Prayer Breakfast. And I was quite shocked because I had given the address in 1997 when Bill Clinton was president. And I had spoken on integrity in office. And it was just before the Lewinsky thing broke. And he must have been saying, does he know something? You know? But I was really shocked that they asked me because, you know, I didn't know that anyone ever did it twice. And I did some research and found out there was one person who had done it twice, and that was Billy Graham. And I said, that's pretty good company. So I agreed to speak. And I didn't know what I was going to talk about. And they kept saying, we need to see your notes because President Obama has to respond to them. And I said, but I don't know what I'm going to say. And they kept bugging me. I didn't know what I was going to say until the day of the speech. And after that speech, everybody was saying, you should run for president. I said, these people are crazy. Why would I do something like that? I said, if I just ignore them, it'll go away. But it didn't go away. Every place I went, people with placards, run, Ben, run. I had over 500,000 petitions in my office. I finally said, Lord, you know I don't want to run for president, but if you really want me to, you have to give me all the things that a person who runs for president has, like a Rolodex with all the important names in them, an organization, a lot of money. And I said, I'm not going to go out and try to develop those things. The next thing I knew, they were all there. Our organization was raising more money per month than the RNC. It was incredible. But as I traveled around this country, from the smallest little hamlets in Alabama or North Dakota to the largest cities, one thing very much impressed me. That is that the American people have common sense. It was really very encouraging. But there was also something discouraging. And that is, a lot of people don't have courage. They would rather stand in the corner and stare at their feet than to speak up for what they believe in. They don't want somebody to call them a nasty name or try to cancel them. That's a problem. And that's something that we're going to have to overcome because You cannot be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. And people have to be willing to stand up for what they believe in. And what's going on in our country right now is something that can only be remedied by we the people. Government's not going to fix itself. It never does. You know, our founders were pretty amazing people. They studied every governmental system that ever existed in the history of the world. They were eclectics. They took the good stuff and they tried to use that to form the basis for our government here. One of the things that they noted is that all governments kind of end up the same way. No matter how they start, no matter what their lofty goals are, they grow, they infiltrate, and they dominate. And they wanted to give us something that would keep that from happening. And at the last Constitutional Convention in 1787, you know, they were into some pretty fierce arguments to the point that the whole thing was about to dissolve and everybody was go their separate ways. And then the elder statesman, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, stood up and he said, "Gentlemen, stop." He said, "Let's get down on our knees and let's seek wisdom from God." And they got down on their knees and they prayed. And when they got up, they put together the Constitution of the United States, which I believe is a God-inspired document. But when Benjamin Franklin came out of that building, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what do we have here? A monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it. If you can keep it." We've kept it for 247 years. We're as close to losing it right now as we have ever been. Not paying attention to those things or reinterpreting that Constitution. You know, in 1958, a man by the name of Edward Lewis Shemp filed a lawsuit against the Abilene County Board of Education because they required the school day to be started with the Lord's Prayer and with a Bible reading. The state of Pennsylvania tried to accommodate him, said children can be excused from that requirement if they have a note from their parents. That wasn't satisfactory to Mr. Shemp. And the lawsuit continued. It ended up 5 years later at the United States Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional to have prayers that were required or Bible readings. That was the beginning of the religious decline in our country. They continued to the point where the Supreme Court said they forbid every form of public aid or support for religion. Complete separation. Now, when you stop and think about it, does that make a lot of sense? When our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, says that our rights come from God. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Does it make any sense when our Pledge of Allegiance says we're one nation under God? Does it make any sense when many courtrooms on the wall it says, "In God we trust"? Or when every bill in our wallet and every coin in our pocket says, "In God we trust"? So why would we throw all of that away? But that's what's happening to our society. And it's happening quickly. You know, in 1972, 90% of Americans identified as Christians. Only 5% identified as no religious affiliation. 50 years later, we were down from 90% to 63%, with 29% with no religious affiliation. Think about how rapid that change has been. And in 2021, it was the first year that more than half of Americans had no identification with a church. So it is changing very rapidly what's happening to our country. And the traditional nuclear family is being threatened also. You know, we live in an amazing country. Candy and I have been to 68 different countries. We've lived overseas. And I can say, without doubt, this is the best country in the world. We are blessed to be here. But we're going to have to fight to maintain that. It's wonderful to be here, and all of us, no matter where our ancestors came from, England, Nigeria, Portugal, doesn't matter where they came from, you're probably better off being here than you are in that place. And it's an incredible place that we live in. But are we going to be able to keep it? If you wanted to bring this country down, let's say you were interested in one world government, hypothetically, who would be in your way? The United States of America, with our system. But you would know that you could not bring the United States of America down militarily. It's much too strong. So you would fight to bring it down from within. To destroy it from within, you have to get to the very foundation. And what is the foundation of a society? They want you to believe it's the government, but the foundation is the family. This is what God ordained. A man and a woman together. And they would have children. And they would be fruitful, they would multiply, and they would control the environment. And look at all the things that have happened now to thwart the concept that God wanted. And what is the direction of our country? Well, some people say all of this has been of recent origin, but it's not of recent origin. It's been going on for a long time. If you go back and you look at the congressional record from January the 10th, 1963, Congressman Herlong of Florida read into the record the 45 goals of communism in America. All of this is in the book, The Perilous Fight. But just a few little excerpts from those 45. Number 15, capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. Number 17, get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum, get control of teachers' associations, put the party line in textbooks. Gain control of all student newspapers. Use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organizations which are under communist attack. Infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy-making positions. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. Think about all those things. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech. break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion, discredit the Bible, and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. Discredit the American founding fathers. And here's one that really gets you. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. Does any of that sound like what's going on today? That was over 60 years ago. But the political environment today opens the door and allows things that they've been working on for a long time to gain traction. That's what we're dealing with. Think about, where do children get their values from? From the family. But if you don't have intact nuclear families to pass those traditions on, you end up with situations like we're seeing on these college campuses, with kids running around advocating for terrorist organizations because they don't have a solid foundation. That's why the family is so important. And yet, we see family formation falling behind. People are not getting married, or they're waiting till very late to get married. And when they do get married, easy divorce. No-fault divorce, which sort of started in the 60s, and it's just mushroomed, and the divorce rates increase. You know, why don't people realize anymore what marriage is and how important it is to have a partner? You know, when people get married, it's like taking two people from very different environments, putting them together, and expecting everything to be completely smooth. That's not true, is it? You guys know. In the beginning, there's a lot of friction. It's like taking two pieces of sandpaper and rubbing them together. But if you keep rubbing them, they get smooth. You just have to stay in there long enough for it to get smooth. And that's not what we're seeing today. We're seeing to have and to hold until you get irritated with each other, and then move on to something else. And what do you see when you look at television? You know, go back to Dick Van Dyke. I mean, he and Laura slept in separate beds. Not only do they sleep in the same bed now, but you don't have to be married to them. In fact, all the coolest people meet somebody and are in bed with them that very night. And that's considered normal now. So, making promiscuity and sexual deviation normal, natural, and healthy. What is that doing to our society? Stop and think about that. And the fertility rates, of course, have gone way down. We have the lowest fertility rates right now that we've had in a century. 1.6 babies per woman. To maintain the population requires 2.1 babies per woman. So we're below maintenance level. Now, the left uses that as an excuse to say we should have open borders and we could bring everybody in because we need to bolster our population. Well, we definitely need to bolster our population, but not with anybody who wants to come into the country. When you think about it, if you were a terrorist and you hated the United States of America, and you wanted to do great harm to the United States of America, and the United States had open borders, wouldn't you take advantage of that? Wouldn't you be sending all kinds of people in here and planning some incredible havoc and disaster? I mean, if you weren't doing that, you would be guilty of terrorist malpractice. And I'm sure they are doing that, and we need to be vigilant and we need to be praying, because the only thing that is sparing us right now is the mercy of God, and we need to continue to ask him for that. But continue on this decline in the family. Have you heard the term DINK, D-I-N-K, double income, no kids? It's becoming a popular phrase now. It's the new American dream. Don't have to worry about the kids. We can make all this money and we can lavish it upon ourselves. What kind of citizens are we creating? And do you realize that 30% of Gen Xers identify as LGBT? 30%. Now, they say that that's because it's become more acceptable now, and therefore people feel comfortable coming out now. The reason I know that's not true is because if that were the case, it wouldn't just be Gen Xers, it would be across all generations you would see that happening, and you do not see that happening. So there's a lot of social pressure which is causing this to happen. And then all the transgenders that are coming out. You know, we have a difficult situation here because Jesus loved everybody and he died for everybody. But he didn't accept what everybody did. And, you know, the church and the Bible speaks about what is right and wrong. The problem today is that people say, your truth and my truth, but not the truth. God has given us the truth. He has given us a standard to live by. But let me get back to this transgenderism for a minute. You know, think about the miracle of birth. You have a male gamete with 23 chromosomes, a female gamete with 23 chromosomes. They come together, fertilization occurs. You have a zygote with 46 chromosomes, the complete map for a new individual, not part of the mother, not part of the father, a completely new individual. And that brain starts forming immediately. Millions of neurons every single day. Later on, billions of neurons every day. By the time that baby is born, that brain is still rapidly forming. That's why newborns sleep 20 to 22 hours a day. And that brain continues to develop right up into your mid to late 20s. Some people, it never fully develops, but but think about the implications of that. You have 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old children who have undeveloped brains, and you have people who are trying to tell them that you're not really a girl or really a boy. And children, of course, are very suggestible, and they're very curious. That's why God gave them parents, to protect them from unscrupulous people who take advantage of that immature brain. And yet we're seeing that in a lot of our public school systems, and they try to exclude the parents from even knowing about what's going on. And those poor children are being exposed to this. It is nothing short of child abuse that is going on, and we have to be the ones who protect them. That's where the courage comes in. Because when you stand up, people try to persecute you. And they try to create problems for you. And look at all the examples of that in the Bible. But the way I look at it, and people have tried to create problems for me too, but the way I look at it, no matter what problems they create, what is that against the backdrop of eternity? And that's the thing that should always comfort us, knowing that we are living for something greater than what exists on this earth. And we have to remember to do those things that are right. But back to the family again. Do you know that 18 million children are growing up in fatherless homes? 1 in 4 growing up in fatherless homes. Now, what does that mean? What kind of problem is that creating for us? And I'm looking at that clock back there and trying to figure out how much time I have to talk about that. But I'm not saying that you have to have the perfect Leave It to Beaver family. You don't. But it helps. Statistics show us that. Both liberal and conservative study groups show that children who grew up in a traditional nuclear family with both parents have much better outcomes academically in terms of their profession, much fewer problems with mental illness, with drug addiction, with alcoholism, with teen pregnancy, with just about any parameter that you look at. So there really shouldn't be a big question about it. But there is something that can help mitigate when you don't have a traditional family. You know, in my case, my parents got divorced when I was 8 years old. I was devastated. And I prayed every night, Lord, please help them to get back together. But they never got back together. Years later, I understood the reason for that. Because my father was into drugs, gambling, women. Women are okay, but you only need one. And, that probably would not have been a very good situation for me. And I was a terrible student. And my brother was a terrible student. My mother had only a third grade education. Had gotten married at age 13, trying to escape dire poverty in rural Tennessee. Had the responsibility of trying to raise us, but she had that mitigating factor. She had tremendous faith in God. She believed that God was the answer to everything. She also absolutely refused to be a victim. No matter what was going on, she never felt sorry for herself. Problem is, she never felt sorry for us either. So, she never accepted excuses. If we ever made an excuse, the next thing out of her mouth was a poem called Yourself to Blame. And when you grow up in an excuseless environment, you learn to look for solutions, and it makes a big difference. And she didn't know what to do about my terrible academic performance, and she prayed and she asked God for wisdom. And God gave it to her. My brother and I didn't think it was that wise. I mean, turning off the TV and making us read books, what kind of wisdom is that? I mean, in today's world, we would have called social services on her, but we had to do it. And as I started reading those books, I actually began to enjoy it because we were desperately poor, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I started reading about people of accomplishment, great leaders, And I began to realize that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. Those are the kinds of values that people get from family. That's why the family is so vitally important. And I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class in a year and a half. The same kids who were teasing me and calling me dummy were coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I would say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys, you know? But you know, later in life, as an attending neurosurgeon, I was thinking I was pretty special. I was saying, you came out of Detroit, you went to Yale, University of Michigan, Johns Hopkins, you're chief of pediatric neurosurgery at age 33. I said, you are a bad dude. But then along came this little boy, child prodigy, Bible verses memorized at age 2. But by age 4, he was losing all of his function. He was diagnosed with a malignant brainstem tumor. The parents were people of means, and they saw a lot of people, and everybody told them the same thing: take the boy home, keep him comfortable, and let him die. And they ended up at Johns Hopkins. And when he rolled onto that ward, barely moving, barely breathing, saliva coming out of his mouth, eyes looking in different directions, I was thinking, what am I supposed to do here? And I looked at the CAT scan, and there was a big, ugly brainstem tumor. And the parents said, Doctor, the Lord led us here because we would find a Christian neurosurgeon, and God would heal our son through him. And I said, but there's nothing I or anyone can do about that. This is an inoperable malignant brainstem tumor. And they said, but doctor, the Lord. And I said, look, MRIs were brand new. Let's do an MRI and see what it shows. And all the radiologists looked at it and they said, malignant brainstem tumor, nothing to be done. And they said, but doctor, the Lord. I said, once in 1,000 cases, the scans are wrong, and sometimes you can have a big inflammatory process that looks like a tumor, so I'll do a biopsy. Took him to the operating room, did a biopsy, the frozen section came back, high-grade glioma, a very malignant tumor. I took out as much as I dared, closed them up, went out and talked to the family. I said, I'm afraid it's what we thought it was. And only God knows how long a person is supposed to be here. We'll understand it better by and by. And they said, thank you, doctor, but the Lord. And as I walked away, fully expecting that boy to deteriorate and die, I said, I've never seen people with this kind of faith. But instead of deteriorating, he got better. His eyes started looking in the same direction. He started handling secretions. I said, what's going on here? And I said, let's do another MRI, and we did. And there was still a big, ugly tumor, but there was a little ribbon of tissue way up in a corner. I said, is it possible that this is not in the brainstem? It's outside the brainstem, has crushed and displaced the brainstem? Maybe we should go back in. And the parents said, by all means. And I went back in there, and under the microscope, the character of the tumor had changed. And as I peeled it away layer by layer, I got to the last layer, and there was a glistening white brainstem, smashed and displaced, but intact. Long story short, that boy walked out of the hospital and is a minister today. But one of the oncologists came to me and he said, Ben, I've always been an atheist, but now I'm a believer. But it wasn't for him, it was for me, because see, I thought I was doing all this stuff. And after that, I realized it was God. And I said, from now on, Lord, you be the neurosurgeon and I'll be the hands. And that's where the term gifted hands came from. That's when all kinds of amazing things began to happen. And you know, amazing things can happen in our country too, but we must be willing to do our part, submit to God, and let him be the force in our lives. Our country is due for a revival. Each one of us has a sphere of influence. It starts with our families. but it goes to our communities. It goes to our workplace. You're told from the time that you're a child, there are two things you shouldn't talk about: politics and religion. That's exactly what we need to be talking about right now, because, you know, evil flourishes in darkness. Doesn't want you talking about it, doesn't want you to see what's going on, discussing what's happening in your lives. And we have the ability to change that through our Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you.